A young woman who had just graduated from college was found dead inside her own apartment, and the case quickly became one of the biggest stories in the city. Police had dozens of suspects, but for more than 20 years, they still couldn't find the man responsible. That finally changed when detectives uncovered a truth no one saw coming. And even then, the case still had one last twist waiting at the end. Debbie Dorian was born on June 20th, 1974, in Fresno, California. Debbie was the kind of person people naturally liked being around. She was warm, upbeat, had a wide circle of friends, and was already thinking seriously about her future. After high school, she enrolled at Fresno State, where she began studying economics. She also rented an apartment about 10 minutes from campus, wanting a place that felt like her own and a first real taste of independence. But even as she was building a life outside her family home, Debbie remained very close to her parents and stayed firmly connected to them. By that point, they had divorced and her father had remarried, but he still lived in Fresno and continued to play an important role in his daughter's life. While she was in college, Debbie also started dating a guy named John. Their relationship lasted nearly 3 years, and although they were serious about each other, they still lived separately. In 1996, when Debbie was 22, she graduated from college and was thinking about graduate school. She was looking at different programs, including some in other states, and on August 22nd, she was supposed to drive to Sacramento with her father. He was a doctor who specialized in treating hearing disorders, and Debbie was starting to seriously consider following in his footsteps. They were planning to look at a few study programs, and Debbie was supposed to stop by her father's house on the morning of August 22nd so they could drive to Sacramento together. But she never arrived. Her father tried calling her several times, and when Debbie still didn't answer, he became worried enough to drive over to her apartment himself. Debbie lived on the second floor of a small apartment building. Her father was about to knock on her door when he noticed it was slightly open. That made him even more worried, and he stepped inside. He called out his daughter's name, but she was nowhere to be seen. He started checking the rooms, and eventually, he heard the sound of a TV coming from behind Debbie's closed bedroom door. Thinking she may simply not have heard him, he opened it, and was immediately met with a horrifying scene. Debbie was lying on the floor. Her clothing was missing below the waist, and her shirt had been pulled up. Her hands and feet were bound with duct tape, and her head was almost completely wrapped in it. Shocked by what he was seeing, her father rushed to Debbie's side and began trying to pull the tape away from her head, hoping there was still some way to help her. But within minutes, he understood the truth. His daughter was already gone, and there was nothing he could do to save her. He then went to the nearest phone, but it had been unplugged. The man was in shock, so instead of calling the police first, he called his wife, who then called 911. While she was telling the operator that her husband had just found his daughter's body, he called his ex-wife, Debbie's mother, and told her that someone had killed their daughter. As soon as officers arrived at the victim's apartment, they realized that Debbie had already been dead for some time, though they still needed to wait for the medical examiner's report to get a more precise time frame. Based on the way Debbie's body had been bound, it was obvious to detectives that they were dealing with a murder. There were no signs of forced entry in the apartment, and no signs of a struggle either. On the contrary, police saw a half-eaten sandwich and other food on the table. It looked as though Debbie had been just going about her day when the killer suddenly arrived. Maybe she knew him and let him into the apartment without hesitation. Or maybe he threatened her with a weapon when she opened the door and forced his way inside. At the same time, none of the neighbors had heard screaming or any other noise. The only useful lead came from a woman who lived a few doors down from Debbie. According to her, a man she had never seen before had walked up to the victim's door, and Debbie had opened it for him. The neighbor heard them say hello and exchange a few ordinary phrases. Something like, "How are you?" Then everything went quiet. The woman hadn't been able to get a good look at him, so she could only give police a very vague description. He was a white man, somewhere between 20 and 45 years old, and about 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 11 inches tall. So that statement didn't bring investigators much closer to an arrest. But there was something else in the neighbor's story that was far more interesting. According to her, she had seen the man outside Debbie's apartment after noon on August 20th, 2 full days before the body was found. After speaking with Debbie's family and friends, police learned that no one had heard from her during that entire stretch of time. But this was 1996, and for the people close to her, going a couple of days without a phone call didn't immediately seem alarming. Before long, the medical examiner's report came in, and it confirmed that Debbie had indeed been dead for 2 days. Experts placed her estimated time of death sometime between noon and 4 p.m. on August 20th. As expected, the cause of death was suffocation caused by the tape, which had left Debbie unable to breathe. On top of that, experts found signs of sexual assault and recovered 2 biological samples from the killer: his saliva and semen. DNA testing was already being used by that point, but it was still a relatively new tool in criminal investigations, and the FBI database did not yet work the way it does today. So, detectives focused on finding possible suspects, and the first person they looked at was Debbie's boyfriend, John. But police quickly confirmed that he had a solid alibi. He was on the other side of the state, helping fight wildfires. At the same time, John told investigators something useful. According to him, Debbie had recently been struggling to pay her bills. She lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment, so she was urgently looking for a roommate who could rent the spare bedroom and help cover some of the costs. Debbie had been putting up flyers all over her university campus and hoped to find someone as soon as possible. John also told detectives that Debbie had written down the names of people who had responded to her roommate ad. And sure enough, when police searched her apartment, they found a sheet of paper with several names on it. From that moment on, every person on that list became someone investigators had to take seriously as a potential suspect. Investigators had just begun looking into the people on that list when something unexpected happened. Police received a call from a man named Alvin, whose name was on that very same list. And he told them he had spoken with Debbie shortly before she was killed. According to Alvin, he had responded to Debbie's roommate ad, gone to see the apartment, and decided he wanted to move in. He paid a deposit and signed an agreement. But after that, Debbie suddenly stopped returning his calls. At first, Alvin thought he may have been scammed, so he went back to her apartment, hoping to speak with her in person. When he reached the 2nd floor, he noticed that Debbie's door was slightly open. He knocked several times, but no one answered, and he said he never went inside. Instead, he turned around and left. To detectives, all of that sounded pretty suspicious. First, Debbie's friend said she'd been looking for a female roommate and didn't want to share the apartment with a man. Second, the whole story about going back to the apartment could have been a very convenient explanation in case police found his fingerprints on the door, or in case one of the neighbors had seen him there. Detectives quickly uncovered another fact that did not work in Alvin's favor. He was on the sex offender registry, and given that Debbie's killer had sexually assaulted her, Alvin immediately became the main suspect. But there was one problem. As we remember, on the day of the murder, the neighbor had seen a white man, while Alvin was African American. Still, police couldn't be 100% sure that the man the neighbor saw was actually Debbie's killer, so it didn't completely clear Alvin. While speaking with him, detectives learned something else. Alvin didn't have a car of his own, so a friend named Maurice had driven him to Debbie's apartment several times. Police contacted Maurice and he confirmed Alvin's story. He also said Alvin simply wouldn't have had enough time to commit the crime, because he had come back to the car pretty quickly after finding no one at the apartment. Police looked into Maurice and learned that he was an Army veteran with no criminal history. But investigators weren't ready to rule either man out, so they asked both of them for DNA samples. They provided them voluntarily, and while the lab was running the tests, detectives spoke with both men several more times. During one of those conversations, Maurice suddenly said that shortly before the murder, he had bought several rolls of duct tape to repair a punching bag at his house. Detectives found that extremely strange because they hadn't told him a word about the tape on Debbie's body. Maurice claimed that one of the officers had mentioned the tape during their first conversation, but to investigators, that sudden comment became a serious reason to suspect him. Before long, the lab results came back, and Alvin's DNA did not match the killer's semen or saliva. But with Maurice's sample, things were much more complicated. As I mentioned earlier, DNA testing in 1996 was still gaining ground, and the tests used back then were not nearly as precise as they are today. In Maurice's case, experts couldn't fully exclude the possibility of a match, but they also couldn't confirm one. In other words, from a scientific standpoint, there was still a chance that the semen and saliva recovered from Debbie's body could belong to him, and for police, that was more than enough. They arrested Maurice and put him in jail, while also ordering a more advanced DNA test that was supposed to settle the question once and for all. Maurice spent 2 weeks behind bars before experts came back with unexpected news. The more accurate test showed that the killer's biological samples definitely did not match Maurice's DNA, and he had to be released. After that, police looked into several dozen more suspects, but every time, DNA testing ruled them out, and detectives found themselves at a dead end again. Debbie's parents also fought hard to keep the case alive. They gave interviews, put up flyers with information about the murder, and constantly pushed police to keep working. Debbie's mother even made the lead detective promise that he would never stop looking for his daughter's killer, and he gave her his word. Debbie's relatives also raised $10,000 and offered it as a reward for information in the case. Later, local authorities added a substantial $50,000 on top of that, and police received quite a few tip calls. But time after time, they led nowhere. Investigators also entered the killer's DNA profile into the FBI database, but there were no matches. Over the next several years, detectives checked around 150 men, but every one of them was cleared after DNA testing. That continued for several more years, until in 1999, detectives received an unexpected call. The DNA sample from Debbie's killer matched a sample from another crime. That case had happened on July 30th in a town called Visalia, about an hour from Fresno. Late that evening, a 19-year-old woman was riding her bike home from work. She was moving down an empty, poorly lit street when a man in a hood and bandana suddenly appeared in front of her bike. He threatened her with a gun, forced her off to the side, sexually assaulted her, and then ran away. The young woman managed to get home and call police, and forensic experts later recovered the attacker's biological material and entered his DNA into the database. It turned out that the same man who had murdered Debbie was behind that attack too. And for detectives, this wasn't exactly a shock. From the beginning, they had considered the possibility that they were dealing with a serial offender. The way Debbie had been killed suggested that her murder may not have been his first crime. But there was one major problem. Even though investigators now knew another place where the man had struck, they still had no real way to identify him. During the attack on the 19-year-old woman, he had kept his face covered, so she could only give the vaguest description. A white man, somewhere between 5'7" and 5'11" tall. She had heard his voice, and in theory, she might have been able to recognize it. But for that to matter, police first needed a suspect. They sent officers to patrol the more secluded streets, where the man might theoretically look for another victim, but that didn't lead them anywhere. That continued for 2 months, until an 18-year-old woman from Visalia contacted police. She said she had been walking home from work when a man in a hood suddenly appeared in front of her, pulled out a gun, and forced her off to the side. He demanded that she perform a sexual act on him, but the woman refused, and the attacker became angry. But, for some reason, he let her go, and she went straight to the police. The circumstances of that case were almost identical to the previous attack, and to police, it was obvious that the same man had to be behind both of them, Debbie's killer. But once again, the victim couldn't give police any useful details about the attacker's appearance, so investigators were left with nothing. 2 years later, another similar crime happened in the city. A man in a hood, armed with a gun, sexually assaulted a young woman who was walking home from work along a dark street. About a year after that, a similar-looking man approached another young woman at a bus stop and started touching her while threatening her with a gun, then ran away. There were other cases police believed were connected to the same serial offender, but in those attacks, the man didn't leave behind any DNA, so detectives couldn't confirm the connection with complete certainty. In total, they counted at least 7 similar crimes, but they still couldn't identify the man behind them. After that, the case went cold once again for several years, until in 2009, police ran into a very serious problem. Under California law, the statute of limitations for sexual crimes was 10 years, which meant they had only a few months left before the deadline expired in the first sexual assault case involving the 19-year-old woman. Since detectives were still nowhere close to catching the attacker, they decided to use a legal loophole. The police department issued an arrest warrant for the offender not by name, but by his DNA profile. That effectively paused the statute of limitations indefinitely, meaning the offender would no longer be able to avoid punishment simply because too much time had passed. Still, in the years that followed, investigators got no closer to an arrest. The similar attacks also stopped, and it began to look as though Debbie's killer had either stopped hunting young women or something had happened to him. The next 10 years passed without any real movement in the case. But in 2018, everything changed. Detectives decided to take another look at Debbie's case and use a new DNA tool at the time called genetic genealogy. They contacted the same company that, earlier that year, had used the method to identify serial killer Joseph DeAngelo and sent them the DNA sample from Debbie's killer. Experts began searching public genealogy databases for distant relatives of the offender, and by 2019, they were able to narrow it down to one specific family. The most likely suspect was a 52-year-old man named Nicky Dwayne Stain. He fit the age, the location, and the other criteria, but police still needed to get his DNA sample to confirm the experts' findings. He was still living in Visalia, and from the outside, his life looked completely ordinary. He had a wife, children, and a mortgage. He worked as a restaurant manager at a mall, had no criminal history, and was actively involved in his neighborhood. But detectives immediately noticed one specific detail. Remember the list of potential roommates Debbie had made shortly before her death? On that list, there was the name Nick. Debbie had crossed it out and written another name next to it, Rick. Then added that she needed to call him in a few days. Detectives decided to move carefully and came up with a plan to get his DNA sample without him knowing. They dressed up as garbage collection workers, drove up to his house, and took bags of trash from outside. After going through the contents, they found 2 men's razor blades that most likely belonged to Nicky and sent them to the lab. Before long, experts called detectives and told them the sample from Debbie's body was a full match to his DNA. So, 23 years later, they finally had the killer's name, and investigators moved to the final step. In October 2019, detectives went to the mall where Nicky worked and approached him inside his restaurant. Leading the conversation was Vincent Zavala, the same detective who, 23 years earlier, had promised Debbie's mother he would find the man who killed her daughter. And now, after all those years, he was finally one step away from keeping that promise. The detective didn't arrest Nicky right away. Instead, he decided to ask him a few questions first. He asked whether the name Debbie Dorian meant anything to him, and Nicky said no. He also said he had not killed her, and at the end of the conversation, he added that he hoped they would catch whoever had done it. After that, Nicky walked away. But what he didn't know was that officers were already waiting around the corner with handcuffs. He was arrested for Debbie's murder, as well as for a series of assaults. and then taken to the station for questioning. To investigators' surprise, Nicky immediately began admitting to the assaults in Visalia, but he did it very carefully. When police asked him about specific crimes, he would say things like, "Yeah, that sounds like me, but I'm not sure," or "That sounds like something I could have done." Nicky added that, in the past, he had serious problems with sex addiction and had done things he was ashamed of. He admitted that he had approached women on the street and forced them to do different things. But whenever detectives started asking him about each individual case, he would dodge the question and avoid giving a clear confession. At the same time, Nicky kept bringing up his addiction, though he spoke about it in a calm, almost casual way. According to him, he had used the services of hundreds of sex workers and watched huge amounts of adult material, but none of it had been enough to control the addiction. He even said his bedroom looked like something out of 50 Shades of Grey. So Nicky was essentially admitting his involvement in the assaults. But when it came to Debbie's murder, things were different. He denied ever having contact with her and tried to convince detectives he had nothing to do with her death. But his story suddenly changed when detectives told him about the DNA results. Nicky then said that, actually, he had known Debbie after all, and that they had been intimate by mutual consent. According to his story, he had once picked Debbie up on the street while she was walking along the road. They had sex, and then he dropped her off, thinking they would never see each other again. But according to Nicky, Debbie later came to his workplace several times and asked him to have sex with her. Finally, he claimed that he had also been intimate with her at her apartment, and that some other man had been there too. Of course, detectives didn't believe a word of it. It looked as though Nicky was simply trying to explain why his biological material was found on Debbie's body, and was making up an excuse as he went along. While they were questioning him, police were also searching his home. By then, he was living alone, and in his bedroom, they found a large number of adult toys. But that was only the beginning. Police learned that Nicky had been renting out part of his house on Airbnb, preferably to young women, and forensic investigators quickly found hidden cameras in the shower connected to the rental space. Detectives also learned that Nicky had a social media account under a fake name. There, he presented himself as a successful executive at a large company, apparently to impress women. But despite all of that evidence, he still refused to admit he had murdered Debbie. He hired attorneys, and the case moved toward trial. The defense built its argument around the idea that Nicky really did have an addiction, and that he may have committed several sexual assaults in his hometown, but that he had never killed anyone. The prosecution, however, had 2 separate DNA samples from Nicky that had been recovered from the victim's body. And soon, they got something else. While Nicky was in jail waiting for trial, he had a phone call with his mother, and a recording of that call was given to investigators. His mother asked him, "Are you innocent of any of these crimes?" And Nicky answered, "Not really, Mom. I was kind of involved in all of them." Preparing the case for trial took several years, and eventually, prosecutors announced that they planned to seek the death penalty. Realizing he most likely would not be able to avoid that outcome, Nicky finally decided to plead guilty to Debbie's murder. On May 15, 2025, he officially admitted what he had done in front of a judge, and also pleaded guilty to the series of sexual assaults in Visalia. In exchange for his guilty plea, he received life in prison without the possibility of parole, instead of the death penalty. Debbie's relatives were present at the sentencing, as were one of his victims, who admitted that even after all those years, the sound of his voice still terrified her. After the sentence was handed down, Nicky waived his right to appeal, which meant he lost any chance of ever getting out of prison. Because the terms of the deal did not require him to give a detailed account of what happened, Nicky never revealed the full circumstances of the crime. Still, the evidence was more than enough for prosecutors to lay out their version. In their view, Nicky responded to Debbie's ad for a roommate and came to her apartment. He then pulled out a gun and forced his way inside. Once there, he wrapped tape around Debbie's head, hands, and feet, assaulted her, and left her to die. On one final note, it's worth mentioning that Detective Zavala, who had promised Debbie's mother he would see the case through to the end, continued working on it even after retiring. He and his former partner became unpaid volunteers and kept putting in the work to help catch the man responsible. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.